Hi all, welcome to Fuqua's LinkedIn Live. I'm Victor Bennett. I'm faculty here in the strategy area. You might remember me from such videos as my last LinkedIn Live session on automation and competition. Today, I'm going to talk about entrepreneurship, particularly through the lens of what's been going on recently, kind of in the shadow of the global pandemic. I've had the tremendous opportunity to get my hands dirty with startups from a bunch of different angles. I've been an early employee, an advisor. I've studied startups from an academic perspective and worked on policy around entrepreneurship in the White House and the New Zealand Performance Panel. I'm going to try and bring some of those different perspectives to bear here. So I'm going to start talking about recent news and help you interpret some of the statistics you're seeing in the press. Then I'll talk about some of my own research and the barriers to startup growth. And if there's time and if anyone's interested, I'll talk a little bit about some advice that I've had for startups from work that I've been doing in New Zealand. So while the stock market has been doing really well lately, Main Street has been suffering. Unemployment claims are increasing and have been at all-time highs recently. In looking for solutions, a lot of people are looking to startups. One reason for that is that some recent research shows that most new jobs actually come from new firms. It turns out that big firms hire a lot, but they also destroy jobs at roughly the rate that they create them. So some recent press that you might have seen, like in the Wall Street Journal, is seeing positive signs in the increase in business formation. For example, they're seeing a lot of new applications for business licenses. Now, there are reasons to feel really good about this. One is that these new businesses might actually be more productive than old companies. A bunch of research suggests that, which could be really good for recovery. I actually had some experience with this at Google in 2003, where kind of a lot of old guard businesses started to shrink. And that gave Google the opportunity to hire a bunch of really incredible staff and put them to work on some new things. There's also a lot of reasons to be guarded, though. First, small business revenues are not keeping up with the applications. You can see that here. And there's a bunch of potential reasons for this, and I'll transition to my research to talk about that. So even in good times, you'll find that a lot of entrepreneurs are people who want to be their own boss or are having trouble finding work. It's actually a relatively small number of prospective entrepreneurs that actually saw a business opportunity and are trying to take advantage of that business opportunity. And that's troubling because a lot of the folks who start businesses because they have to, or because they want to be their own boss, are less likely to professionalize, and so they're even less likely to be efficient. For example, here's some research that I did with Ronnie Chatterjee, looking at the steps that different new businesses took towards business formation. And it falls off pretty quickly. You can see, we'll put up a link to the research, but you'll see that even very basic steps, like seeking advice from people that you don't know, are pretty rare. And actually, my colleague David Robinson, who you might have seen on a LinkedIn Live a couple of weeks ago, has coined one of these, or has called one of these steps the latte step. This is the step where you talk to someone who's an expert in your industry, but isn't someone that you already know. And so David says, for the price of a latte, you can have a meeting with them and get some free advice. But actually, remarkably few people do that. Even basic project management details like setting milestones and having regular meetings are really rare, even though we've seen a really strong correlation between having these basic steps and whether or not you're able to move forward and quit your job or hire someone and move forward in the steps of creating a business. So the professional practices that a lot of startups aren't using are pretty definitely tied to doing better. They increase revenue in basic experiments, for example, randomized control trials by Nick Bloom and John Van Reenen. So why don't people use these steps? So I'm going to talk a little bit about some research that I've done with colleagues. So here is a graph of the scores of management practices from the World Management Survey, which I'll talk about a little more and is some data that I've used in the past. And you'll see that it's pretty strongly correlated with firm size. So it's the smallest firms in particular that are the least efficient and the least professional. Now, this could go two ways. One is because professionalism leads to growing the firm. The other one is that it's the smallest firms that aren't implementing these. So here is one statistic that we found that was really, really interesting. And it makes us think that one reason why firms may not implement these professional practices is that the founders, because they started a business with the goal of being their own boss, want to keep control. And so they often don't implement practices that would make them replaceable. And one piece of evidence that we found that kind of supports that is that when founder CEOs are replaced, for example, by a private equity firm or by a VC that funds them, often the management practices score goes way up right away. And you'll also find that in industries where businesses need a lot of outside financing, that the scores are much better. And one reason for that is that to be able to get outside financing, a lot of times you need to have levels of professionalism where the bank or whoever your founder is feels like if something happens to you, that's not the end of the world for the business. The other thing that we found is that this gap depends on whether or not there's a really strong family orientation in the community that you're coming from. And one reason that seems to be coincident with this is that a lot of people as founders want to be able to hire their friends and family. And if you professionalize and have a repeatable hiring process, that can mean that you give up the opportunity to hire family. And so you're in trouble at Sunday dinner, but it also may mean that you're more efficient because it's rare that your cousin is the best person at the job. Now, another possibility is that it's actually really hard to professionalize, and it may be particularly hard for founders to professionalize. So this is research, this is from our survey, and we asked people, what is the main reason that kept you from advancing in your business? And they gave us a number of reasons, but actually the most common reason is an execution failure, is that they actually tried to advance their business, but were struggling to be able to do it. And that's really fascinating because a lot of these practices seem like things that you should just be able to put into place. And the fact that it's hard to implement these practices may be the reason why you see such a skewed distribution of the returns to venture capital-backed startups. In fact, the vast majority of venture-backed startups actually earn nothing. It's very few startups that have huge, huge returns that are driving the venture capital success. Talking about David Robinson again, this graph is from a beautiful study that David did looking at the performance of startups. Now, many of you may be asking a question that a lot of people asked us about what is driving entrepreneurship, particularly in the context of economic development. Now, what a lot of people have asked about is, what about financing? Because there's a lot of concern that the availability of financing is what's holding back startups. Now, that's interesting because it's something that we wanted to look into. So we dug into whether people had actually looked for financing, whether the people for whom financing was available were starting more businesses, and whether or not the areas that had the most lenient regulations actually had the most business creation. And this was one of our most interesting results. So of the entire set of people who said that they couldn't move their business forward because they couldn't get financing, less than 8% of them had actually tried to get financing. They hadn't gone to banks, they hadn't applied for financing, they hadn't set out venture capital. And so you may say, well, why do they think that financing is actually the barrier to what they're doing? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is that maybe they got a sense of the likelihood of getting financing from somewhere other than trading. In this latter case, I would say that it's probably not the financing that was really the barrier, but it was the quality of the idea. And then to dig into this further, we looked at some regional economic development indicators. We used statistics from the thumbtack.com and Kaufman survey to look at whether or not places with more lenient regulation actually got more business startups, and to see if places that had more networking programs, accelerators, and serious similar business opportunities actually had more startups. And we found basically no correlation at all. Then we got some data from the Tax Foundation on which areas have the most lenient taxation policies for businesses and the lowest cost of registering. And we found no correlation there again. And so it seems like financing, while I'm sure it is a barrier in many cases, is not the primary barrier for a lot of people. And so that raises the question, is the major barrier execution, and what can we do about it? Well, maybe one of the things that we can do about it is things like what Fuqua is doing with our curriculum for entrepreneurs to try to disseminate the kind of practices that can make your business be more likely to get from 0 to 60 or from you to a world-changing business. So from there, I want to go on to answer your questions. Thank you so much. And let's get on with it. So the first question that I had, oh, this is actually a really interesting one, is that I've just been talking so much about professionally managing a business. What does that even mean? What does it mean to professionally manage a business? So in business schools, usually what we're talking about when we talk about professional management is transparent and repeatable processes. So for hiring, this might look like if you have a meeting where you ask the same questions to every candidate and you have clear guidelines about what kind of person you want to hire for a job. So what might a non-professional practice look like? Well, I've been in a number of organizations where you go in, you ask whatever you want, and at the end you say, this person is a good fit, or I have a really good feeling about them. Now, is that always bad? Not necessarily. That could mean that you're getting people who are a really good culture fit, but it also means that the process is somewhat arbitrary and it's not going to be repeated. For the people that are already hired, you want a very clear idea of what their job is, and you want to be able to measure it, reward them for it, tell them how they're doing, and give them advice on how to improve. This is something that my operations colleagues, like Robert, who you saw last week, call continuous improvement. If you want to benchmark yourself, I highly encourage Google the World Management Survey, and you can go take a look at it. This is primarily a survey to score businesses, but they also have the actual questions in the survey, and they let you benchmark yourself against similar businesses. Go ahead, take that survey, and get a sense for where you are. Don't be defensive about it, because some of these things you may not actually want to change, but at least try to make that a conscious decision so that you can actually make a process that scales up. And one of the reasons that founders have told me that they don't use these practices is that they feel a little bit silly being really structured and rigorous with a really small business. For example, when I talk to folks in Y Combinator or Techstars or 500 startups, they say like, look, there's 3 of us in the same cube. We don't need to have regular meetings and benchmarks. We just talk all the time. And I say, well, look, that works for you while there's 3 of you in a cube, but it's not going to scale up. And you don't want to try to implement those changes once it's too late and you have all of your routines in place. So maybe, just like they say, dress for the job you want to have, establish the processes for the company that you want to be. Okay, question number 2. Someone asked about the survey and the demographics of the people that we surveyed. That's an awesome question. Sounds like someone's a social scientist, and I'm thrilled. So the way that we did the survey was we got a broad balance of the American population, and then what we did was we balanced it against census data on the demographics. So that means that if you are in a group that it makes up 10% of the US population, then 10% of our estimates come from your answers. So what does this mean in practice? Well, it means that if a very small portion of businesses, particularly maybe those started by MBAs or people who have business experience, are very professional, our data aren't saying that they're not professional, it's saying that they're a very small proportion of the average. So one of the things that we're doing with these data now is to move forward and dig into particular segments of the population. I have a paper with David Robinson that we're working on right now, looking particularly at minority business startups and how the barriers that they may face could be different than the barriers for the broader population. And if you are interested about those results, look forward maybe to a LinkedIn Live down the road. Okay, next question. What advice would you give entrepreneurs on executing? Okay, so this is something that I've been working on a lot, actually, to develop curriculum to train people. And it's something that I've been working on with the country of New Zealand as part of their performance panel. So the idea is that they have a lot of small businesses, a lot of people who haven't had the opportunity to get formal business education. Can we give them some guidance on how to execute and build their businesses to help build their communities? So here is kind of a flow chart that we use to take the broad infinity of changes that you could make to your business and narrow it down to particular things that you can change. So the first thing, the first branch in our flow chart is, are you shipping a product? Are you to the point where people can actually use your service or use your product? If you are at that point, I'd like you to benchmark yourself against the World Management Survey. For example, the hiring criteria and the benchmarking criteria. If you are shipping a product, then what I want you to do is take a series of steps to figure out what type of problems you have. And the first step here that I recommend is take a look at your costs. So this is, look at what your inputs cost, look at what your labor cost is. Do you have higher waste when you're producing? If you have a service, are your employees spending more time on administration than a lot of your competitors? If your costs are similar to your competitors, then that's one branch. If your costs are higher, then that's another branch. So a couple of you may ask me, how am I going to figure out if my costs are similar? You're not going to be able to see the balance sheets for your competitors, but there are some things that you can figure out. If you have a rough idea that they produce a certain amount more than you can say, like, does their staff look much bigger than mine? Do they have a big building? Are there a lot of cars in their parking lot? A lot of times, if you have the same suppliers, you can ask something that will get you at some idea of whether or not they're bringing a lot more, they're buying a lot more inputs than you are. That's particularly helpful in businesses where there are very, very standard inputs. Okay, if your costs are similar and you're still not making enough, then you need to focus on revenue. Is your margin similar to companies elsewhere that are doing the same thing that you're doing? If not, you might have a competition problem. If your problem is competition, that means change your business offering to be different enough that you can command a higher price. Now, a lot of businesses don't have competitors, right? You might be a coffee shop in an area without a lot of competitors. You may be offering a pretty different service. So if you don't have competitors and your costs are similar to everyone else, maybe the answer is as simple as raising your price so that you can have a higher margin. If your margin looks good, but you don't have enough customers, then this is where what you need to do is spread the word. So if you've worked your way far down enough this process that it seems like marketing is your problem. If your costs are the same, sorry, if your revenue is the same, but your costs are higher, you don't have a marketing problem. That's not the dimension on which you'll be able to change. So business is complicated. There's a million moving parts, but actually figuring out what are the particular problems can make this a much, much easier process. Okay, someone else asked, ooh, this is another really good one. Is more entrepreneurship good? So one of the questions we've gotten is that you're asking about how we get more entrepreneurship, but what if this is bad? What if these are really bad ideas and it's good that they're not starting? So a lot of the questions in our survey went to get at these ideas. Now, a central idea for business school folks is that it's very hard for us to evaluate the quality of a business. We'd rather have the market tell you whether this is a good business or not. And there's a bunch of reasons for this, including not having a diverse enough workforce to know what people really want. And also just a lot of businesses might be changing behavior in ways where it's hard to know whether people are going to adopt it. But what is important is knowing whether or not the entrepreneurs themselves believe that this business is productive enough that they should invest their time in it. If people are quitting their job to start something that they don't have high hopes in, then potentially that's a problem and we may have too much entrepreneurship. If people genuinely believe in these businesses, that's a really, really important thing to know. And so a couple of the things we did was ask questions about people's perceptions of the economy and compared these to the Consumer Expectations Survey or data from the census on people's beliefs about the economy, and looked at whether entrepreneurs were more confident or less confident about the economy than the general populace. And what we found is that they're actually pretty similar. Then we asked a number of other questions to figure out whether or not the people who have a higher outside option, so that is whether the job that they would be quitting would be even better, start different types of businesses. And we did find data consistent with people who have higher outside options, starting fewer businesses, but more promising ones, and taking more what we called heavy steps. So this is comparing it to the lean startup method, that these people are doing more formal business processes and applying for things like patents and registering in Delaware at higher rates. But that doesn't mean that some of the most powerful businesses are not started by people who couldn't find good opportunities elsewhere. So we believe that a lot of the entrepreneurship is beneficial, can help drive economic development, and that the biggest way that we can contribute to this is in the Fuqua style, with developing new curriculum, both for the MBA students and more generally, and doing events like this to help people understand what the barriers are to what they're facing. So that is the summary of what we're doing. I am so thrilled that I got a chance to talk to you. We'll have a link to the data if you are interested, and some summary statistics. And if you want more content like this, come to Fuqua, take my class, or you can also check out future LinkedIn Live events. Our next one is going to be Fuqua accounting professor Scott Dyring, talking about a few of the proposed tax reforms from the presidential campaigns and the potential economic consequences. That's one that I'm really looking forward to because he's an expert on this and the taxation questions are really complicated. And tune in. Thank you very much.